Good evening, and thank you for joining us virtually at the Scheller College of Business at Georgia Tech. I'm Maryam Alavi, Dean of the Scheller College of Business, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome and introduce today's speaker, Pearl Alexander. Pearl serves as a diversity and inclusion leader and culture coach in the Office of Institute Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Georgia Tech. A change agent, she has catalyzed transformations in culture and organizational leadership practices for over 30 years. Reporting to Georgia Tech's Chief Diversity Officer, she oversees a creative portfolio focused on leadership development and employee engagement that forwards culture transformation and proactive culture management. Georgia Tech's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion provides leadership to establish priorities, policies, and programs that support our mission as a leading technological university in the 21st century. We are honored that Pearl has joined us this evening despite her very busy schedule. Pearl, welcome and thank you. We will start with some introductory remarks, Pearl, followed by a few questions from me, and we will then open it to the audience questions. Audience, you can enter your questions in chat, and Pearl will answer as many of your questions as time permits in the last portion of the program. Pearl, I now turn it to you.
Okay, thank you, Maryam. And I've got a few slides here that hopefully will appear momentarily. As I think about this year and I think about where I started, I was thinking back to the beginning of the year, and I was sitting in the Oprah 2020 Vision Tour when it came through Atlanta. My daughter and I decided to do a mother-daughter thing and go to that. And interestingly enough, the theme for the year was transformation and triumph. Transformation and triumph. Wow. As I thought about that, and then kind of fast forwarded to the last few weeks as I was preparing and thinking about what to talk about, those words kept resonating in my mind and in my heart. This double pandemic of racism and racial injustice and social injustice and COVID-19, which seemingly has exacerbated that. And so we're here to think about these big concepts around anti-racism, racial justice, and taking positive action. So as we think about that, I'd just like to offer just a little bit of context in terms of being here together today. Maryam talked a little bit about Institute Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and we have indeed been busy this year. We've had lots of conversations. Over the summer, we started right after the death of George Floyd and all of the surrounding activities, the protests, the hashtags. So this evening, wanted to just kind of end with that human experience in mind and understanding that we probably need some centering, that we need to focus on solidarity, becoming, and some really practical things we can do as we're working to shift and become better people so that we can create a better world. So if we'll go to the next slide, the concepts, as I mentioned, I'll touch briefly on anti-racist ideology, racial justice and the practice of racial justice. I'll talk about individual skills, a few individual skills we can practice, a few organizational practices we might think about, and ultimately also some leadership skills that we might think about as well. Next slide, please. As we talked about anti-racism and what is it to be anti-racist, we reflected on Ibram X. Kendi's book, and most recent book around how to be an anti-racist. And what he points out in his book and his work is that it's really an ideology that we're talking about. It's not people we're talking about, but the ideology that leads to behavior that we might then demonstrate with one another. And so we sat with the question, and we continue to sit with the question of how to be anti-racist, because any of us could show up and be anti-racist anytime we buy into anti-racist ideology. And so we need to think about how to get that into our bones, how to be anti-racist in our bones, because what we've probably grown up with and may readily reach for is more of what we've become accustomed to, which is the antithesis of anti-racism, which is racism. So as a leadership coach, I always ask the question, what might we need to shift in order to actually be anti-racist, to practice anti-racism? And so it lands me at the next slide, which is really talking about racial justice. So let me talk about anti-racism for just a moment. Anti-racism is when we are active. Go to the next slide, please. Yeah. Anti-racism is when we are actively using our influence, to confront racial inequities, to confront them in a way that's not confrontational, so to speak, but in a way where we are more reflective about what it is we want the outcome to be. So it's in that spirit that we think about what are some of the things that maybe we've gotten used to doing that we need to stop doing, that we need to undo. And what are some new habits that we'll need to create for ourselves in the process? Next slide, please. And I think it's best thought about simply, right? My colleagues and I talk about this often, that there's brilliance in simplicity, because when we think about racial justice, sometimes it might feel big, it might feel heavy, especially after the year that we've been through, where we've seen so much and we've been exposed to so much of the circumstances and the vivid details that we've seen when we're not practicing racial justice. But in simplicity, I would say that racial justice is choosing some things, and it is choosing to see each other and to see our common humanity first and foremost. And it's choosing to acknowledge that, not to deny it, not to pretend like we don't see it, but to see it, acknowledge it, to validate each other in our various social identities, and that can lead us to transformation, to choose to be together, to choose to be generous with each other in how we show up. And when it's called to our attention that we believe that something we might be operating in some kind of way out of a bias, or that uh, something is feeling, seemingly unjust, that we actually are more willing to stop and take a look at it and unpack that situation. So it is choosing to see, choosing to acknowledge, and then choosing to transform what actually is. It's letting go of whatever limiting beliefs we might have in order to be better and to be better together. And Lord knows this year we've had a lot of opportunity to pivot. So if we had probably thought about a pandemic of the proportions that we've seen in terms of COVID-19, we probably wouldn't have known that we could actually pivot in the ways that we have over the last year. And what I'm suggesting is we think of racial justice in that same way, that we show up understanding we might have to pivot. We might have to throw out what we've been doing. When we couldn't meet in person, we went to a different option. And so it's the same with that. And it starts with the basics of how we look at each other, how we see what we're doing together, and how those outcomes are actually evolving. Are they meeting our intention, or are they negating our intention in some form or fashion? And when they are negating our intention, to be willing to step back and say that, to see it and to transform. Next slide. I think the thing that has come up, at least for me, in my experiences, I've had the opportunity to sit with myself more and more during COVID, is this concept around solidarity. That being together in solidarity around racial justice can literally change the world. We've seen the protests, around the world, literally. And so this concept of solidarity is important. What it seems like is that we agree, we are in agreement somehow that things have got to change. So I'm very optimistic about that. Very optimistic about that. When I look at what we're doing together, what we're willing to do together, I'm encouraged by that. I'm hopeful. But we come together, we're generous in our assumptions with each other. We're aligned. We're simply saying, let's continue to be in this together. Let's not let this be a moment, but that it continues in terms of a movement. Next slide, please. So what do we do? Right? We've been talking because we needed to process. We needed to process the emotions. We needed to understand things we always do in terms of skills and what it means to show up together, what it means to be together. How are we going to move the needle? There's an individual transformation that comes about whenever we want to change something. And so that individual transformation is the recognition that we do have power, that each and every one of us has something that we can contribute to this, not just the conversation, but what actions. We all have access to feelings and emotions. And one of the most important emotions that I think can help us along the way in terms of racial justice is empathy. So racial justice has some skill sets, and I've been studying some of those, and interestingly enough, some of them align with some of the concepts that we've been teaching and the Inclusive Leaders Academy, this notion of rumbling with vulnerability. We've all been rumbling with vulnerability. If you know anything about Brene Brown's work in Dare to Lead, she talks about vulnerability, being willing to show up and being seen, even when there is emotional risk and uncertainty. And so we've certainly dealt with that. And the other skill set that she talks about is empathy. And it's what I think can be a real transformational type of skill if we're willing to lean in and practice that. And so empathy requires us to be able to tap into the experiences of another with our emotions. And we know that whenever we have an emotional experience, it moves us. And true empathy requires us to not only be aware of our own emotions, but to then be able to understand what someone else might be feeling and experiencing, to see various perspectives, and to be very mindful in our approach to processing and being with one another. Next slide, please. And then as an organization, big picture, high level, as an organization, we need to think about both strategy and culture and structure. And my caution here is that we move to thinking about structure and we're not necessarily connecting strategy and culture. And so it's important because we're just coming off of completing and announcing and launching a strategic plan. And what's exciting, I hope, for me in the plan is around the fact that we are talking about culture and shifting the culture. So we're not just talking about where we're going, we're talking about who we are going to be as an organization and what we expect of individuals in the organization, how they're going to show up, how we're going to be together. We're establishing cultural norms that will support racial justice, that will support inclusive leadership. And that's critical. And so in the Inclusive Leadership Academy, we always also talk about courage because that's important. It's another aspect of Brene Brown's work in Dare to Lead. Without courage, none of this is really going to be possible. We can put the nice words on the paper, we can talk about strategy, but culture is what people actually experience on a day-to-day basis. And that aspect of culture management that allows us to be very inclusive, to be intentionally inclusive, is really important. So we have to cultivate courage, and we cannot forget that before we can really address structure, we have to deal with culture, and culture has to move along with strategy. And so let's move to the last slide, please. And in true coach fashion, I ask a question. So who do you want to be? Where are you in all of this? As I sit and I think about it for myself, I have had to reflect very deeply around what are the things that I need to let go of. As an African American female, I will need to do some more work around where I may have internalized racism. I have to do that work. As long as I'm, if I don't do it and do it deeply enough, then I may not show up well enough with all of you. So one thing I know is that as we facilitate these conversations, we are doing our work. And so we are individually doing our work. And I would also invite you to join us on this journey of doing the individual work, the healing that's required that may relate back to some of those scripts and beliefs that we have that have us operate on autopilot from day to day, that might disconnect us from each other, that might disconnect us from our goals as we think about them. That it's important, yes, when we talk about our strategic plan, that we want to lead by example. We want to be an institution where we are leading in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, that we care about people and we care about the well-being of people. All of this supports racial justice. We have to figure out where we are on the continuum and where we want to be, and then figure out what it is we have to unlearn to create new habits. And in the words of Mary Pfeiffer, who talks about writing to change the world, she says that the way we change the world is 1,000,000 individual acts of kindness. And with that, I will stop there and take some questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Pearl, for sharing your thoughts and valuable insights on anti-racism. You talked briefly about competencies and skills for inclusive leadership. Could you elaborate on some of those skills at the individual level? You started with empathy and just digging a little deeper into those.
Yes, and so there are a few that come to mind, and the few that we try to give a foundation around in the Inclusive Leaders Academy, for example, are self-awareness, and that is the work that I was just talking about. So self-awareness means that you really have a good understanding of who you are. You know, you understand the good, the bad, and the ugly. You know, a lot of times it's hard for us to look in the mirror at ourselves and realize, uh, eh, there is that is part of the human experience that we need to realize where we have some shadow work to do, where we have some ego work to do, where we need to be more clear for ourselves about our mission and vision and values. And another is empathy. And empathy is a superpower. And we always know whenever we've been in the presence of someone who's very empathic. Brene Brown, in her work around Dare to Lead, talks about empathy, and she says that the skills involved with empathy are listening. And I could give a whole talk on listening, perspective taking. So we all have our individual worldviews, but we also need to learn to hear other people's worldviews. And this is the beauty of diversity. When we have diversity, we talk about making it a strength in our plan. Actually, it's only a strength if we leverage it, not being wedded to one way of doing things or one way of being. All of these come together in empathy. Staying out of judgment, something that's really hard for a lot of us to do, is staying out of judgment, and really being able to tap into emotions and to be emotionally fluent. This is something that also isn't emphasized a lot, but where we are now calls for really a new brand of leadership. And these are just some of those skill sets associated with racial justice and that simple notion of how do we show up together and how do we work together.
Very good. So From the individual level, how can we elevate these to organizational setting? How can we embed these skills in practice in organizational settings?
Mm. So that's a wonderful question. I think it starts with the leaders, right? It starts with the leaders being committed to modeling these behaviors. That we establish that we first start with saying, these are behaviors we value. And then we have people align with those behaviors. We help them through opportunities for training and learning, coaching, mentoring, all of these things. We might even use 360-degree instruments to ensure that people understand, but establishing as part of the culture what is expected, what is permitted as behavior is, I think, where we start.
Great. So what would be some of the other systemic practices where we need to embed anti-racism? What might they look like?
So I think in all of our talent practices, for sure, my background is people and culture. So I immediately think from my vantage point, what are the things we need to do? And I think that's definitely the ways that we hire, the ways we promote and pay people, all of our talent practices, the ways we develop people to ensure that there's fairness in all of that. And I think if we do that, then we actually come to a place where we're not talking about compositional diversity so much. We have had to focus on compositional diversity because, we don't always see people of color in lots of different roles and positions. There's certainly been challenges in terms of representation. And so we keep spinning that wheel, and it feels like we have to get beyond that.
Excellent. So you are a member of the Office of Institute Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion unit. What is this unit really excited about? What's going on?
So we're excited about the new strategic plan, and we're excited about training opportunities. Oh my goodness, over the summer, and that has continued into the fall. We've been asked quite a bit about training, and dialogue, and people have reached out, units have reached out, and so we're excited about that. We're excited about our new Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council that's going to be an institute-wide group of leaders coming together to talk about these issues regularly to help prioritize and actually energize and move initiatives forward so that we can shift the culture here at Georgia Tech and the leadership culture in particular, and that hopefully that will translate into the experience of our employees and our students who show up to study with us here. Hopefully we can model what it is to be an inclusive culture and organization, and that's what I think we're very, very excited about in Institute Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
Excellent. So you talked a little bit about the importance of culture as a driver of strategy and then structure. Mm-hmm. Where are some of the challenges that we still may have to surmount in transforming the culture?
Yeah, I think there are some older notions of what it means to be a leader. I think there are some notions, some resistance, in fact, to racial justice, and inclusion. Uh, I think we've got to help people understand what it looks like. I think people have a natural resistance to change. And one of the skills that I think we've got to help introduce to people more, because it's not only is it brain training, but it's kind of embodied leadership and embodied behavior. We've got to really learn to sit with discomfort. And so when we sit with discomfort, then we can move away from resistance. A lot of times resistance comes because we feel like we're losing something. We fear loss more than we fear change. And so we've got to work through some of that with people. And all of these are behaviors we have, so it's what makes up the culture. And ultimately, people have to be able to come to work, to bring their whole selves to work, to show up and be able to contribute. And so what we've got to create is psychological safety for people. And that even includes some failure allowance, in many ways. So it's really shifting what the notions of leadership maybe have been in the past, from more of a command and control, and among the few, to something that's much more distributed, and something where we all can contribute.
Very good. I heard that was the last question. So Pearl, thank you for being with us tonight and for sharing your valuable insights on a very important topic. And audience, thank you for your participation, and I hope you found tonight's event as informative as I did. I am delighted to have someone like Pearl at Georgia Tech with her vast knowledge, energy, to be able to work with us and transform the culture and develop our skills in anti-racism. So really appreciate all the great work you do, particularly in the area of inclusive leadership. I've had the good fortune of participating in some of those sessions. So I'm very appreciative of all that you do, and I know you will continue to do for Georgia Tech. This concludes our program for tonight, and good night. Thank you very much.